Rogers Rangers was initially a provincial company from the colony of New Hampshire, attached to the British Army during the 7 Years' War. The unit was quickly adopted into the British Army as an independent ranger company. It was trained by Major Robert Rogers as a rapidly deployed light infantry force tasked mainly with reconnaissance as well as conducting special operations against distant targets. The tactics were built on earlier colonial precedents and were codified for the first time by Rogers. The tactics proved remarkably effective, so much so that the initial company was expanded into a ranging corps of more than a dozen companies. The Ranger Corps became the chief scouting arm of British Crown forces by the late 1750s. The British valued them highly for gathering intelligence about the enemy. Later, the company was revived as a loyalist force during the American Revolutionary War. Nonetheless, a number of former Ranger officers became Patriot commanders. Some ex-Rangers participated as Patriot militiamen at the Battle of Concord Bridge. Queen's York Rangers of the Canadian Army, formed by Rogers and loyalist veterans of Rogers Rangers, claims descent from Rogers Rangers. History. Rogers' rules of ranging. French and Indian War. Rogers Rangers began as a company in the provincial forces of the colony of New Hampshire in British North America in 1755. The unit was the latest in a long line of New England Ranger companies dating back to the 1670s. The immediate precursor to and model for the unit was Gorham's Rangers, formed in 1744 and still active in 1755. Rogers' company was formed to fight in the French and Indian War, in the borderlands of the colonial Northeast. Commanded by First Captain, then later Major Robert Rogers, they operated primarily in the Lake George and Lake Champlain regions of New York. The unit was formed during the winter of 1755 from forces stationed at Fort William Henry. The Rangers sometimes undertook raids against French towns and military emplacements, traveling sometimes on foot, sometimes in whaleboats and, during winter, on snowshoes. Over the course of 1756 and 1757, the usefulness of Rogers' company prompted British officials to form a second Ranger company, and eventually 4 more. By early 1758, the Rangers had been expanded to a corps of 14 companies, containing 1,200 to 1,400 men. This included 3 all-Indian units, 2 of Stockbridge Mohicans, and a third of natives from Connecticut. Eventually Rogers was promoted to major and served as Commandante of the Ranger Corps. On January 21, 1757, at the First Battle on Snowshoes, Rogers' force of 74 Rangers ambushed and captured 7 Frenchmen near Fort Carillon at the south end of Lake Champlain. They ran into about 100 French and Canadians militia in Ottawa from the Ohio Country. After taking casualties, Rogers' force retreated. In reports, the French noted the tactical disadvantage which they suffered, as they lacked snowshoes and were floundering in snow up to the knees. Rogers' Rangers had maintained positions on the high ground and behind large trees. According to Francis Parkman, Ranger casualties were 14 killed, 6 captured, and 6 wounded. The French, consisting of 89 regulars and 90 Canadians and Indians, had 37 killed and wounded. The French Indians' casualties may have included one of the captured prisoners. It is unclear if this was the fate of the other captured French as well. A company of the Rangers led by Noah Johnson was stationed at Fort William Henry in 1757 during the siege. The siege ended with the surrender of the British forces and a massacre. After British forces surrendered Fort William Henry in August 1757, the Rangers were stationed on Rogers Island near Fort Edward. This allowed the Rangers to train and operate with more freedom than the regular forces. On March 13, 1758, at the Second Battle on Snowshoes, Rogers Rangers ambushed a French Indian column and, in turn, were ambushed by enemy forces. The Rangers lost 125 men in this encounter, as well as 8 men wounded, with 52 surviving. One reference reports casualties of the regulars, who had volunteered to accompany the Rangers, as 2 captured and 5 killed. Of Rogers Rangers, 78 were captured and 47 killed and missing. Rogers estimated 100 killed and nearly 100 wounded of the French Indian forces. The French, however, reported the casualties as 10 Indians killed and 17 wounded, and 3 Canadians wounded. The French originally reported killing Rogers in the second battle. This was based on the findings of his belongings, including his regimental coat containing his military commission, but he escaped. This episode gave rise to the legend about Rogers sliding 400 feet down the side of a mountain to the frozen surface of Lake George. While there is no proof of this event, the rock face became known as Rogers Slide or Rogers Rock. Arriving on the provincial vessel King George, 4 companies of Rogers Rangers were at Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, April 8 until May 28, awaiting the siege of Louisbourg. While they scoured the woods to stop raids on the capital. In the siege, the Rangers were the first to go ashore at freshwater cover and faced 100 MIKMAQ and French soldiers. The regiments of Ensign Carruthers was killed. James Wolfe and Scott followed up the Rangers. The Rangers killed and scalped the chief MIKMAQ. In the retreat, the Rangers captured 70 defenders and killed more than 50. This achievement was reported to be one of the most admirable feats ever performed by a detachment of the Corps. On July 7–8, 1758, Rogers Rangers took part in the Battle of Carillon. On July 27, 1758, between Fort Edwards and Halfway Brook, 300 Indians and 200 French Canadians under Captain St. Luc ambushed a British convoy. The British lost 116 killed and 60 captured. On August 8, 1758, near Crown Point, New York, a British force of Rangers, light infantry and provincials was ambushed by a French-Canadian Indian force of 450 under Captain Marin. In this action, Major Israel Putnam was captured. He was reportedly saved from ritual burning by the Iroquois by intervention of a French officer in a providential thunderstorm. Francis Parkman reports 49 English fatalities and more than 100 killed of the enemy. Rogers claimed English losses were 33 and that the enemy had losses of 199. Another source reports that the French casualties were 4 Indians and 6 Canadians killed, and 4 Indians and 6 Canadians, including an officer and a cadet, wounded. During 1759, the Rangers were involved in one of the most famous operations, the St. Francis Rey. They were ordered to destroy the Abenaki settlement of St. Francis in Quebec. It had been the base for raids and attacks of British settlements. Rogers led a force of 200 Rangers from Crown Point deep into French territory. Following the October 3, 1759 attack and successful destruction of St. Francis, Rogers' force ran out of food during the retreat through the wilderness of northern New England. Once the Rangers reached a safe location along the Connecticut River at the abandoned Fort Wentworth, Rogers left them encamped. He returned a few days later with food and relief forces from Fort at No. 4, the nearest British outpost. coast. In the raid on St. Francis, Rogers claimed 200 enemies were killed, leaving 20 women and children to be taken prisoner, of whom he took 5 children prisoner and let the rest go. The French recorded 30 deaths, including 20 women and children. According to Francis Parkman, Ranger casualties in the attack were 1 killed and 6 wounded. In the retreat, 5 were captured from one band of Rangers, and nearly all in another party of about 20 Rangers were killed or captured. One source alleges that of about 204 Rangers, allies and observers, only about 100 returned. Pontius Rebellion. At the end of the war, the Rangers were given the task of taking command of Fort Detroit from the French forces. After the war, most of the Rangers returned to civilian life. In 1763, Rogers recruited several volunteers for the reinforcement of Detroit, commanded by James Dalyell of the 1st Royal Regiment and formerly of the 80th Regiment of Light Armed Foot. Upon arrival at Detroit, Dalyell talked the post commandant Henry Gladwin into allowing Dalyell to take his reinforcements to attack an Indian village near Parents Creek. The force of 250 to 300 soldiers of the 55th and 60th Regiments, Rogers Volunteers, and the Queen's Royal American Rangers under the command of Captain Joseph Hopkins was ambushed as the advanced guard made up of men from the 55th Regiment crossed their bridge at Parents Creek. Rogers' men were responsible for effectively covering the retreat of the force back to Fort Detroit. American War of Independence. After these events, Rogers offered his help to the commander of the colonial army, George Washington. Washington refused, fearing that Rogers was a spy because Rogers had just returned from a long stay in England. Infuriated by the rejection, Rogers joined the British, where he formed the Queen's Rangers and later the King's Rangers. Several former Rangers served under General Benedict Arnold in revolutionary forces around Lake Champlain. Legacy. The Queen's York Rangers of the Canadian Army claim to be descended from Rogers Rangers, also claiming descent from Rogers Rangers of the 1st Battalion 119th Field Artillery of Michigan and the U.S. Army Rangers. In popular culture, the historical novel Northwest Passage by American author Kenneth Roberts portrayed the events of Rogers Rangers' raid on the Abenaki town of St. Francis. The first half of the novel was adapted as the film called Northwest Passage. During the Second World War, the U.S. Army was interested in the tactics of the British commando units. Recalling the colonial unit, they took the name Rangers as the official title. These units consider Rogers the founding father and distribute copies of Rogers Rangers standing orders to all aspiring Ranger students. The Methuen High School, Massachusetts, uses the nickname Rangers. The town was the birthplace of Robert Rogers. AMC's 2014 series Turned portrays Rogers Rangers as a loyalist militia leader that uses intelligence gathered from an unidentified spy inside the Continental Army to ambush its patrols. Robert Rogers remarks early in the first episode that he offered his services first to George Washington, but he was unwilling to pay what Rogers demanded. Notable members: Major Robert Rogers, Captain James Rogers, Captain John Stark, Joseph Silly, Moses Hazen, Jonathan Moulton, Israel Putnam, William Stark, Simeon Thayer, James Hackett, Captain Nathaniel Hutchins.